And so if we go back to the team behind the original secret team with secret Catholic group, the Knights of Malta Opus Dei, P2 Lodge, and setting up the 6I. The 6I as a private security intelligence agency that can transcend all borders and breach all legislation that has been introduced by Western governments, allows CIA to carry out operations both in USA, Australia, UK, Canada, and all throughout Europe, and of course their free will to do it in all other countries in Africa and South Africa with the 6I. And so the key members are now the same groups that seem to be in all the scandals of Iran-Contra, the October surprise, the Kennedy assassination, knowledge and intimate involvement with that, and also now we're going to be looking at Lyndon LaRouche. Lyndon LaRouche ran the best private intelligence group worldwide. And I'll prove that to you, and not only that, but he always claimed that he was being destroyed. There was a Get LaRouche plan because of his attack on the parties that were involved with Iran-Contra, because of his attack and his publication of doping, which was identifying the consistency of the same players in the secret team that are associated, particularly Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller and Ted Shackley's group, being involved with illegal arms, but also running the biggest drug networks worldwide. And so let's focus now on how they destroyed Lyndon LaRouche and what evidence was it that made him the target. And so I'm going to show in this complete podcast now, the key player is Roy Frankhauser, Ku Klux Klan American Nazi Party, an undercover FBI informer who went by the name of William Bill Clay. Bill Clay was his code name for his FBI undercover informant role with NSC, with FBI, and now I'm going to prove that he was also intimately involved with CIA and NSC for the whole of destruction of Lyndon LaRouche, and I will do a follow-up podcast detailing the overwhelming evidence that he actually was the key player that Oliver North was using, and Dwayne Claridge and Ted Shackley and Richard Secord for setting up all the BCCI accounts for laundering over $8 billion of cocaine into the US and to Australia, hidden in Siemens transformers with a Mossad agent that they also employed, and both of them were working down in Honduras and Nicaragua, involved in military and assassination operations, but primarily Roy Frankhauser was the interface they were using for Manuel Noriega and Pablo Escobar for the arrangement and clearance of all the cocaine coming through down in South America into Australia. The key person that was appointed to actually run the operations, given that Roy Frankhauser consistently was attacking Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller and Ted Shackley, was Oliver North, together with Richard Secord, together with Ted Shackley and Buck Revell. They included in their attacks on these was John Singlaub and Lucia Conan at the operations, in terms of he's running intelligence on all the dope network that they're running. And over here are the two chiefs and founders of the Counter-Terrorism Center, where evidence is that they had an office set up for Roy Frankhauser, was located with an office in Langley as part of the Counter-Terrorism Center team for CIA. We'll also prove that he's the person that did all the introductions to CIA. He introduced Lyndon LaRouche to CIA. So that was further proof in the legal cases that he actually was working with CIA. And you've got to ask yourself the question, why would a member of the Ku Klux Klan American Nazi Party be working with CIA? And over here is Vincent Canestraro, also identified in the legal lawsuit that I've presented in previous podcasts with Lester Coleman in the double Maltese cross legal case against the estate of Ted Shackley with Oswald Lewinter. So the evidence seems to be that Ted Shackley was running a terrorist group in partnership with Abu Nidal, who was receiving checks from BCCI from the Kuwait royal family, and was behind the Pan Am 103 bombing of the McKee team, who were coming back from Lebanon with all the evidence of their illegal heroin distribution with the mafia. So let's go through and we'll have a look at the way that this is all working and the evidence. It turns out that Lyndon LaRouche's group were on the trail of Irangate, but the secret government. They consistently were attacking a secret government that was parallel government running to USA. It was unconstitutional secret government, invisible government, and they called it the parallel government. And it was actually controls the actions visible elected officials. Public awareness of the secret government has been enhanced by, above all, by the activities of leading principal political opponent of the secret government inside the United States. And Lyndon LaRouche Jr. was revealing this. Over 20 years, LaRouche has waged a struggle to expose and dismantle the machinery of this invisible government, seeking to restore the processes of government as mandated by the US federal Constitution. And he says quite categorically that it's starting at around about the year of the Kennedy assassination. He's noticing that there has been aware of a massive increase of the power of the behind the scenes, and particularly the cover-up of evidence relating to the Kennedy assassination and the October surprise to destroy Kennedy, to Jimmy Carter, and also their operations right throughout the 80s and 90s relating to the Iran-Contra and also the war on Iraq. Desert Storm, leading up to setting up that as well, and right through to the 9/11. Lyndon LaRouche was on the attack against Henry Kissinger, a public figure who was also represented one of the leading operatives for the secret government forces. The secret government, for its part, has recognised in LaRouche the leader of anti-totalitarian opposition, the only figure with the intellectual and pragmatic stature to become the fixed pole around which national resistance against the CIA fascist gangster of the invisible government could be assembled. The same invisible government officials were most deeply implicated in Iran-Contra gun running and drug running, and the Iran-Gate cover-up are precisely the ones who have taken part in the illegal enemies list, operations against LaRouche and his political co-thinkers. So Lyndon LaRouche is being destroyed. The secret government assault on LaRouche during a raid of his companies and associates on October to 6th to 7th, 1986, where Edward Spanuous, LaRouche's legal aid, is attempting to persuade officials to produce a search warrant one day after the raid began and to allow defence attorneys to observe the illegal search. The later requests have been denied. Spanuous was jailed along with LaRouche and 5 other defendants on January 27, 1989. These officials include the late Director of Central Intelligence, William Casey, Oliver North, General Secord, Oliver Revelle, or Buck Revelle of FBI, Leo Chern of the President's Foreign Intelligence Board, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, Project Democracy ideologue Roy Godson, Bush Vice President advisors C. Boyd and Gray, Donald Gregg and others, without an overturning of the framework verdicts against LaRouche and his friends, a return to constitutional legality in the United States is impossible. This will require a thorough probe of the office staff files of the former Vice President Bush, who is now President of the United States. Full disclosure must be the watchword. And of course, there never is. Part of the dismantling of the secret government is the freeing of LaRouche and his associates, one of whom, Rachel Asher, has been sentenced to 86 years in jail for the alleged crime of soliciting political loans. I mean, don't you love this? 86 years for soliciting political loans. LaRouche himself was convicted on spurious conspiracy charges in the Federal Court of Alexandria, Virginia on December 16, 1988. On January 27, 1989, LaRouche was given a draconian 15-year sentence by Judge Albert V. Bryan, Jr. And so what was LaRouche attacking, and who are the people that are behind this? And I'm proving to you they're the same people behind the Cercle, 6i, a member of the Knights of Malta, the Opus Dei, and we're involved with the P2 Lodge, and all the scandals that persisted throughout history. Secret government widely recognised. The existence of an illegal secret government has widely been recognised. Senator David Warren, the chairman of Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, used these phrases in several interviews in January 1987 after his committee had completed a preliminary inquiry into the Iran-Contra scandal. The New York Times referred to Project Democracy, conspiracy of the CIA, the Marine Corps and the National Security Council mentioned in the notebooks of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North as a private, secret government. In its leading editorial, this secret government is increasingly recognized as powerful, sinister force responsible for covert operations, assassinations, political coups d'etat, psychological warfare, gun running and drug running in many countries around the world. Also, in parallel to the Kennedy cover-up is the slaughter of witnesses and accomplices. And I think this trend is very disturbing. Over 20 years with established or suspected connections to Iran-Contra operations, witnesses have died over the past several years. Numerous persons with links to Irangate have been indicted on various accusations, in many cases transparent frame-ups. The cover-up of Irangate involves the large-scale liquidation of invisible government assets, variously belonging to the Langley-headquartered Central Intelligence Agency and Project Democracy, and other components who have been compromised. In the aftermath of Iran-Contra scandal, the invisible government has reared up the Bush regime, which, unless present trends are radically altered, is likely to preside over further transformation of the US internal regime from the level of an authoritarian police state to one of a full-blown totalitarian fascist nightmare. This is likely to be accompanied by further worsening of the drug plague, exacerbated by the activities of this invisible government and its foreign allies. I think we've identified the foreign allies, which is Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, P2 Lodge, and also foreign intelligence of MI5, MI6, Mossad, Italian intelligence, German intelligence, and French intelligence, but their own secret 6i. And it goes further. Despite the peace in our time, propaganda of the US, UK, USR condominium, which the secret government has favoured. Kissing grain, balance of power policies in vogue under Bush administration have astronomically increased, and the probability of regional wars in the Middle East and other areas in which turn could lead to a new world conflict. He then is also looking at the history of the British policy. And my evidence has shown that the loans affair that was set up by Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci and Henry Kissinger, together with William Colby, wasn't done alone by CIA. It involved MI5, MI6 agents to undermine the democracy of Australia to ensure that the Echelon satellite network and Pine Gap facilities was not shut down on Australian soil. The worst misunderstanding that could impede insight into the US secret government would be to regard it as an exclusively or even primarily national phenomenon, or to focus on the narrow questions of alleged illegalities. As such, the directions of politics, economics and strategy which dominate the US secret government's deliberations are to a decisive degree determined by the policy choices of the elite of Great Britain and of other countries. And so we can see that Lyndon LaRouche understands that there is an elite group, an elite leadership, born to rule group of people that transcends all countries, that were once part of the British Empire. In May 1982, at the height of US assistance to the UK in waging the Malvinas War in violation of the Monroe Doctrine, Henry Kissinger, the most celebrated foreign policy operative of the secret government, solemnly acknowledged that he'd been a British asset throughout his career. And as we can see, Lyndon LaRouche was consistently attacking Henry Kissinger. At the lower operative level, the various cover-up investigations into Iran-Contra seem to present the United States as acting primarily in cooperation with Israel in support of pro-Iranian policy of the circles around General Ariel Sharon. While these Israeli connections are huge and real, and attention given to them has tended to mask a deeper level of truth, the geopolitical conception behind the arming of Iran derives from British strategy. And I believe that upsetting the neocons is further proof of this as well. The policy of overthrowing the Shah of Iran and bringing in Khomeini to power, pursued by the Canadian-trained Carter National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, was nothing but a version of plans circulating in the British Foreign Office under the designation of the Bernard Lewis Plan for the partition and balkanisation of the area from the Middle East to India and to Bangladesh. The patrons of the Iran policy turn out to be a group in the British House of Lords, including Lord Kaiser, Lord Victor Rothschild. Now remember this, Henry Kissinger is a personal friend of Lord Victor Rothschild, who was MI5, and also behind the family of the Rothschild banks, particularly NM Rothschilds, which controlled the price of gold every Monday morning. Other assets of the Duke of Kent's of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry and their factotum Tiny Roland. And Tiny Roland turns up extensively in his links with Adnan Khashoggi and also with Australian media baron Alan Bond, who received the $6 million cheque from Dr. Earl Bryan, delivered by Richard Babian, working for Richard Secord and Albert Hakim, and delivered to an Israeli Mossad agent, Yossi Goldberg, delivered to Australia, cleared by the Allied Irish Bank and then through Pergamon Trust in Moscow for Robert Maxwell, who was also using the PROMIS software. If one examines the control wires on the canonical Israeli participants in Irangate, like the late Amron Nia, David Cominci, Al Schwimmer and Yaakov Nimrodi, more often than not one will discover a more or less direct link to Tiny Roland and his proprietors in the circles around the British royal family. So LaRouche is being portrayed as being anti-Semitic when he's not. He's actually analysing the evidence of an elite group, an alliance, and partnership. And that's Ted Shackley. Ted Shackley, when being forced to resign from CIA, became the closest liaison that CIA had to Mossad. He was working with Mossad together with Michael Ledeen, who is clearly a triple agent of Mossad, Italian intelligence and CIA, and Alexander Haig together with Henry Kissinger, together with Brzezinski, together with the neocons Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Scooter Libby, have this intense commitment to use the power of the US to support and arm Israel. Nothing wrong with that, but it transcends above their loyalties to the United States. It's a loyalty to the 6I. And it turns out that Executive Orders 12333 and 12334 are introduced. The present foreign and domestic reign of terror by the secret government was made possible by President Reagan's issuance of Executive Orders 12333 and 12334, both signed on December 4th, 1981. These two executive orders allowed the creation of a complex of secret activities by private agencies, effectively beyond the reach of the public law. Under the provision of these executive orders, numerous US allies such as Panama have been illegally subverted and the government of Philippines overthrown, and the foreign governments including USSR and UK and Israel were able to take control over parts of US policy making. And that's the role of Cercle and 6I. They are in control of the think tanks that write the policies. And the neocons are everywhere when it comes to the think tanks for creation of policy for current governments and incoming governments leaders. He goes on to say that the foremost example of growth of lawless private intelligence functions under Executive Order 12333 and 4 has been Project Democracy, and he's homing in on Project Democracy. And I have proven beyond doubt, particularly through the wonderful work of Robert Parry, is that the memos state quite clearly that it was Rupert Murdoch who agreed to fund Project Democracy, or the National Endowment for Democracy Foundation, used by Oliver North. And it turns out that Project Democracy, whose name derives from President Reagan's speech delivered in London Guildhall in 1982. The idea for Project Democracy originated at the meeting of, wait for it, the Trilateral Commission in Tokyo, Japan on May 31st, 1975, which among other things discussed the Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel P. Huntington, Michael Crozier, and George Wanataki ungovernability of democracy. See, these guys hate democracy. They only want to project what's called Project Democracy with policies and leaders that they appoint, that they can control. And so the ungovernable democracy thesis, and it also chose Jimmy Carter to be the next president of the United States. In autumn 1983, Congress created by law the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, as a private foundation financed by congressional appropriation of public funds through the State Department and United States Information Agency. The USIA, the NED, by 1987 was functioning as a private CIA, funding 250 political projects, destabilizing the Philippines, Mexico, Republic of Korea, Panama, Colombia, and getting implicated in running drugs and guns. Project Democracy's program was nothing to do with everyday notions of democracy, but rather prescribes a pro-Soviet, Malthusian ecologist, universal fascist corporate state, dominated by international cartels. Kissinger and Walter Mondale were founding members of the NED board, along with the heads of the Republican and Democratic parties. The board of NED thus being compared to Grand Council of a secret government fascism. And this is the part that's very important. It doesn't matter who's in government, Republicans or Democrats or Liberal or Labor in Australia or the UK, the Tories and their Labor, their people are going to definitely be appointed when they run, are elected using the guise of democracy to still carry out their fascist policy regimes. And Oliver North is definitely on the attack. Oliver North's notebook and flowcharts detailed a money laundering, drug and arms trafficking and covert actions capability with North referred to as Project Democracy. This Project Democracy and the NED are substantially identical, yet the United States Congress, controlled by secret government and blackmailed by omnipresent FBI secret political police, has refused to cancel the funding of the lawless Project Democracy. He also keeps reminding the public, other than Lyndon LaRouche's organisation and the Christic Institute, there was no other groups that were highlighting the obvious, and that is the CIA Old Boys Network, the foot soldiers and mercenaries and adventurers and soldiers of fortune, pilots, arms dealers, and other players who populate the Iran-Contra operational stage tend to be drawn from the CIA Old Boys Network. For example, the personnel and activities of Theodore Shackley, Thomas Klein Network, have been detailed in court papers prepared by the Christic Institute of Washington, D.C. for a federal lawsuit against Shackley Klein's enterprise. While the details of Christic lawsuit may be erroneous, sadly, the following general lines are alleged in numerous published accounts. The Old Boys networks in question represent CIA covert operation capabilities which have developed through tunnel operations in West Berlin in the early 1960s, drug running in Indochina. And I have a copy of the Indochina report. I'll do a complete podcast on that, and that's what Danny Casolaro was pursuing, which led to containers of heroin being shipped out of Desert Storm to New York with the Gambino Mafia, with Shackley's network. During the 1960s and 70s, drug running, assassinations in the Caribbean, gun running and drug running in North Africa and Middle East, and Iran during the last 3 decades. One typical operation of these networks was Air America, the CIA proprietary airline that transported drugs in Laos and the rest of Indochina during the Vietnam War. Surprising large number of pilots who carried out Iran-Contra deliveries during recent years are veterans of Air America. That capability is still around in the form of Southern Air Transport, the CIA airline that delivered arms to the Contras and Contra drug shipments into the United States. The Contras themselves are best seen as yet another drug trafficking permutation of the CIA Old Boys network. And when I do my podcast on Roy Frankhauser, the evidence is clearly evident that it's the same people that were destroying Lyndon LaRouche. One highly publicised sample of illegal weapons train run by the enterprise is, of course, the Turple-Wilson gun running to Libya, for which Ed Wilson was given 52-year sentence in federal prison. The weapons deliveries to Libya were conduited through a firm called Egyptian American Transport and Services Corporation, EASTCO, a company which was owned by General Secord, 49% shares by a company owned in turn by Thomas Klein. Secord's career has been endangered in 1982 by Turple and Wilson scandal, but also the Nugenham Bank scandal, but he had been saved through intervention of Deputy Secretary of Defence Frank Colucci, who overrode advice of the Pentagon's General Counsel to fire Secord because he considered Secord's capabilities a key point in our relations with the Middle East. Secord was chosen by Major General James Vaught as his deputy for second 1980 attempt to free the US hostages in Iran. Colucci, a top official of Sears and Rosebuck, had been instrumental in Kissinger's reform in the Portuguese Empire. During the middle of 1970s, while ambassador to Lisbon, Colucci has been described, if not the heart, then at least a vital organ, like a liver or the stomach of Project Democracy. And I have proven beyond doubt from the evidence that he spearheaded the entire $4 billion Arab loans affair that bring down the democratically elected Australian Labor government, with destroying Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and destroying the Federal Treasurer Dr. Jim Cairns using Robert Booth Nichols, Sir Harry Gillam, MI5, MI6, and Eric Sear Cowles, who worked for both MI5 and MI6 and CIA and was an assassin down in Mexico. And it was in an operation run by Henry Kissinger, William Colby, Ted Shackley, with Frank Colucci. And of course, a big dispute at the time, as I covered in my podcast, is that the Whitlam government was lending a lot of support for the independence of East Timor, which was under Portuguese rule. And hence, all of the work that Frank Colucci had been doing to keep a dictator in power in Portugal by suppressing and assassinating all dissidents, helping their dictator round up all the dissidents in Portugal, was putting at risk their control of East Timor, which had extensive oil reserves. And so that was also the reason for them to remove the Whitlam government, threatening to shut down Pine Gap with the Echelon satellite network facilities that were spying on the Australian government, as exposed in the Falcon and the Snowman movie, and also the evidence that I've put forward in my podcast on the definitive Arab loans affair, evidence that I was able to unravel not only from letters received from Michael Riconosciuto in prison in 2004, but also by following the evidence and statements made by Robert Booth Nichols himself when coming to Australia, telling me that he owned the Baron of Beith restaurant in the Dandenongs that was used as a safe house for CIA and Mafia during the Nugan Bank era. Project Democracy is identified by LaRouche, and also I've identified that it is Rupert Murdoch, Walter Remand, Oliver North, and also William Casey and Roy Cohen, who had opened the doors for Rupert Murdoch to get Australian citizenship so he could buy up and control American media outlets. In return, he agrees to fund Project Democracy, and in return, he then is introduced, also has access with Stanley Schumann on his board of News Limited, has approached William Hamilton at a hotel in Boston to become the Australian and Asian distributor of the Inslaw's PROMIS software, which is modified with artificial intelligence for CIA to integrate into the Swift banking network with Wang Labs, Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc. And so there's the $4 billion Arab loans affair, confirming the role of Frank Colucci, Henry Kissinger, Ted Shackley, William Colby, and Robert Booth Nichols, identified as the link on the Fidco board with Robert Mayhew, the link with the Gambino Mafia, the Yakuza, and the Medellin and Cali cartels for cocaine and heroin shipments coming through the Golden Triangle with Michael Hand, and using Harry Gillam Eric C. Cowles to destroy Dr. Jim Cairns, the Federal Treasurer, and bring down the Whitlam government. So it's the same secret team. So the evidence has already been presented, but what's more important is that Danny Casolaro was investigating ISCO, the Iraq Gate, Iran-Contra, Nugan Bank, and the dismissal of the Whitlam government. He was investigating that, and his evidence was he was investigating the role that Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein were involved in all of these appropriate scandals, and that Kissinger was behind the scenes with the loans affair. He also had the Iran-Contra smoking gun. He had the Monte Carlo BCCI checks and bank letters for Khashoggi and Ghorbanifar financed by the Kuwait royal family. And he had the evidence was in his briefcase, and he believed that he was going to be meeting, arranged by Major Joseph Queller. He was going to be meeting with Robert Altman and Peter Wiedniks in Martinsburg, that he would trade this information for the definitive evidence on PROMIS, which led to his murder. He also was investigating overwhelming evidence that Ted Shackley, Thomas Kleins, William Colby, Frank Colucci, Michael Hand, Robert Burt Nichols were responsible for the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, which I said, but the most important thing is that it was a joint operation. LaRouche is correct. It was a joint CIA MI6 operation in Australia and in Iran. Iran Gate, he then goes on to talk about the other creatures inhabiting the interface of Shackley Kleins with the Pentagon, include Assistant Secretary of Defence Richard Armitage. He says too dirty to face confirmation hearings for the proposed post as Bush Assistant Secretary of State for the Asian Affairs, and therefore still ensconced at Pentagon. And he also has identified Eric von Marbod, the former chief arms sales official at Pentagon, who was investigating the framework of the Turple-Wilson affair. Colucci liked von Marbod so well that he took him along as a virtual chief of staff when he returned to Sears Roebuck. Von Marbod now represents the aerospace firm LTV Corp in Europe. And so we have definitive evidence, and by following the trail, I have done my research from Australia based on corporate documents, based on the links of the PROMIS software and the applications of the software for the first application for tracking submarines, nuclear submarines of the Soviet Union, and being installed upon the Trident submarines in the fire control systems from the testimony of Michael Reconnaissance, and the second application was evidence it was integrated into the SWIFT banking network, and I came up with the same parties. Operational Systems Inc., owned by Thomas Kleins and Joseph Capucci and Edward Wilson with Ted Shackley, was behind the development of all of the team that went across to Simcom Inc., contracted to CIA for the Fusion project to develop the safe software, IRIS-Swift banking software, with Wang Labs, who were business venture partners with Computer Power Group, who provided the expertise with Stanford Research Institute to integrate artificial intelligence for the money tracking all the money laundering operations through the SWIFT network. ISCO, the same team, but Michael Ledeen is in it, with a Richard Secord, Eric von Marbod, all at 777 Leesburg. And what's interesting is they're located at Leesburg Pike. Richard Vigory and his right wing owns the building, is responsible for setting up all of these foundations with John Sildal, a very right-orientated Wackle Moonies link. He worked for the Moonies as well. But in Leesburg is also Lyndon LaRouche. And now we find that he's attacking them, and his company is highlighting all of their business links and operations involved with everything. He then goes on, Lyndon LaRouche confirms the concerns that FEMA and the parallel government And the principal policy commitments of the Project Democracy's secret government was also known as the Continuity of Government, or Rex 84, and it was to the establishment of Khomeini dictatorship in Iran and the unleashing of the Iran-Iraq war as stepping stones to implementation of the Bernard Lewis Arc of Crisis plan for the entire Middle East. And remember Kissinger's principle: the public will only welcome the solution when they're presented with the problem. So if you create the problem, then the public will welcome your solution. The contra gun running and drug running in America's relevant evidence of these points has been systematically suppressed by the FBI and the US Department of Justice, and then ignored by the Tower and congressional investigations. And remember, Senator Tower was then the president or chairman of Pergamon Press, owned by Robert Maxwell, who had the PROMIS software from Rafi Eitan and used in the Eastern European and Soviet Union with Israel, to establish a fascist totalitarian regime in the United States. LaRouche is brilliant. His team is hitting the target. Other members of the continuity government function of FEMA have been Oliver North himself, as well as Oliver Buck-Revell. And we have revealed that Oliver Buck-Revell played a critical role in the cover-up of Pan Am 103 and the bombing of the plane that brought down the Chuck McKee team and the station chief of CIA, who were returning with all the evidence of the secret team's involvement with heroin trafficking worldwide. And so the executive assistant director of the FBI, and we now have further evidence of a senior FBI official, part of the Phoenix team, being employed, and I'll do that as a separate podcast, is being employed, involved in not only the wacko operations, but responsible for all the drug operations with the Shackley team. And so Ted Shackley has his people in DEA, NSC, CIA, FBI, and of course their attorneys are on his companies that are attacking the Christic Institute and also involved in coordinating the legal aspects of the attack on Linda LaRouche. And so, in part through documents obtained by the US government under Freedom of Information, it is known that Buck-Revell, is the operations officer in charge of an inter-agency subgroup of the US government known as Get LaRouche Task Force, whose task is to coordinate infiltration of his organisation, the harassment of his team, the frame-ups, and the possible assassinations against Linda LaRouche and his political friends. So let's look at the evidence. On February 26, 1988, Lawrence Walsh, the Iran Gate special prosecutor, declassified and released to LaRouche and the other Boston defendants a secret cable which had been found in the safe of Oliver North's National Security Council office in the old Executive Office building in White House compound. This was a cable sent on the 5th of May, 1986 by General Richard Secord to Colonel Oliver North. The cable had been transmitted over a special electronic scrambler of the NSA. The cable reads in part, Lewis has met with FBI and other agency reps and is apparently meeting again today. Our man here claims Lewis has collected info against LaRouche. Let's see how polygraph goes. Regards, Dick. Lynn LaRouche's team in their report continues, in the meeting between LaRouche, Boston defense attorneys and federal prosecutor, Assistant United States Attorney John Markham identified that our man here is of this Secord to North dispatch as Oliver Buck-Revell. the number 2 man of FBI, and the leader of Get LaRouche Task Force, as well as the FBI's representative on interagency working groups of the NSC, which oversaw the entire Iran-Contra operation. Later, the government and certain journalists attempted to accredit the thesis that this had been an error and that our man here was actually Assistant to Secor John Karp. I will do a complete podcast. I purchased the document called White House Emails, the top secret computer messages the Reagan and Bush White House tried to destroy. It was a complete rundown of the recovery of all of the destroyed correspondence and emails of Oliver North, and recovered. I purchased not only the book, but it came with the discs, with the originals, and I will show you that there was working within NSC a former FBI agent who had contacted and advised Oliver North that the US Customs agents had discovered their secret CIA operation, the $2 billion brokers of death deal with CIA front companies, French intelligence front companies, and Israeli Mossad intelligence front companies in Singapore, working with the shipment of $2 billion arms to Iran, and advising that they're shutting them down, that this is going to be embarrassing, and Danny Casolaro was holding the confidential memos of that team, and they state and confirm the names of the customs officials. I hold those. So from the emails that were being destroyed, it turns out that someone within the FBI was advising Oliver North about the embarrassing $2 billion brokers of death deal as it's happening. And the memo that Danny Casolaro has is the list of all the weapons, but not only that, they finish off with confirming the names of the agents that have discovered them, and they're now shutting down all the front companies. And the last thing they say is, what does Oliver North want to do with Noriega's drug contacts? They're asking, what does he want to do with them? And that is the evidence that Danny Casolaro had, and the evidence that I'll do in a complete podcast on the $2 billion brokers of death deal was set up by a CIA agent sponsored by Michael Ledeen with Jinsa in 1982, who flew to Israel, sponsored by Michael Ledeen, Jinsa, to meet directly with Rafi Eitan. And I will give you the names of the agents and the reports and evidence that Danny Casolaro had, but my evidence is completely never been seen before. I captured over 20 years all the evidence of this CIA agent, who is the person responsible for setting it up, was sponsored by Michael Ledeen, opening the door for him to fly to Israel to meet with Rafi Eitan. And so here is another example that LaRouche is saying, is that Oliver Buck Revell, the number 2 man of FBI and the leader of Get LaRouche, okay, is working with Oliver North, and he's Oliver North's man. That also supports the legal case that Lester Coleman had launched against the Ted Shackley estate. He had launched a legal challenge, a case against Ted Shackley's estate, Richard Secord and Buck Revell, and Vincent Canestraro, who was the new director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center, that they were he was appointed to investigate the Pan Am 103 bombing. And you will find that they're the same people who are involved with destroying Lyndon LaRouche. Another central feature of White House NSC operations against LaRouche deserves to be stressed. Although Oliver North reported to McFarlane and Poindexter as his immediate superiors in NSC, he also reported to other officials on various phases of his activities. One of the most important of these, wait for it, CIA agent Walter Remand. And I discovered Walter Remand when talking directly with and interviewing Robert Parry, given that I had evidence that he was involved with arrangements for Rupert Murdoch's company that had the PROMIS software, was bankrolling Project Democracy. In a recent issue of the Washington Times, Karen's column reports that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North may have been actually reporting to Walter Remand Jr. And Walter Remand had a career in CIA. He was a CIA veteran. I have found evidence that he was based in Melbourne, in Canberra, I should say, in Australia, in 1970s during the dismissal of the Gough Whitlam, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam loans affair. So he's the man on the ground in Australia who works directly with Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci, Robert Booth Nichols, and Director of Operations, who retired from the agency in 1983, is now Assistant Director of United States Information Agency, the State Department agency which funds the National Endowment for Democracy. That position was created for him in January 1987 after the Iran-Contra scandal broke. Mr. Raymond was quietly moved to USIA from the National Security Council, where he held the title of Special Assistant to the President and Director of International Communications. He has been placed at the NSC by Director Bill Casey and Don Gregg, our new ambassador to Korea, says an insider. While at NSC, he worked closely with Colonel North. Interestingly, Mr. Raymond's name appears on Oliver North's calendar more frequently than any other of the White House employees, say insiders. Senate aides were surprised recently to spot ex-CIA executive Mr. Raymond escorting USI Director-designate Bruce Gelb on his courtesy calls to senators on the Foreign Relations Committee. As it turns out, Walter Remand is also one of the leading officials active in the Get LaRouche task force. I also would like you to see that when I was talking with Robert Parry, I was writing emails directly to William Hamilton on my discoveries in Australia. And this is what I enclose. We have overwhelming legal proof that Charles Wick, Director of USIA, and Walter Remand met with Rupert Murdoch to fund CIA's Project Diplomacy, or Democracy. And they used USIA and international business communications as the vehicle for CIA for funding Richard Secord and Oliver North. International business communications was run by Richard Miller and private CIA's international media coverage, propaganda and computer bias records, retrieval and storage communication services. Charles Wick became a director of News Limited with Rupert Murdoch and Stanley Schumann, the managing director of Allen & Company, which owned Hadron Inc. And also I was interviewing John Belton, and he confirms in my taped interviews with him that he received a telephone call from Stanley Schumann, managing director of Allen & Company, providing personal references for Dr. Earl Bryan for the investors. Now, even with the spelling errors here and the typo errors, you can see that this is an email that I'm sending through straight after my discussions and interviews with Robert Parry. And so we now have definitive proof is that it was the PROMIS software was renamed the Lean software. I got that from the transcripts of Michael Riconosciuto's court case and also from letters that he sent to me from prison And it was Rupert Murdoch's company that sold the lean software to the Australian Federal Attorney General. And so we can now see that in Australia, I had come to the same conclusions, and in the importance of Walter Remand and Charles Wick, and their importance and elevation to even the board of News Limited, with their partnerships with Hadron and Wang Labs for developing the CIA SWIFT software. And so you will find, as we go on now, that I am substantiating the evidence and the credibility of Lyndon LaRouche's targeting of Project Democracy and NED, and the role that they played in destroying him, given the evidence that he was uncovering as well. And so we have identified the same people, and LaRouche's team, turns out that Walter Remand is also one of the leading officials active in Get LaRouche Task Force, and he was in Australia during the Loans Affair, assisting Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci, Henry Kissinger, William Colby, Michael Hand from the Guggenheim Bank, and more importantly, was intimately involved with Robert Booth Nichols, who was all over Danny Casolaro for 4 weeks before he dies. Danny Casolaro was going to expose the Loans Affair, and Robert Booth Nichols and Ted Shackley's role with Henry Kissinger's role and Frank Colucci's role to destroy the Australian government. So we actually have now confirmation of the same team who destroyed the Australian government, and behind the Cercle and 6i is the same team that's now out to destroy LaRouche. When I picked up the phone and called Robert Parry, introduced myself to him, he was astounded by what evidence I had. I have my recorded interviews with him and the exchange of information that we did and discussions. What I was particularly interested in is getting copies of the memos that show that the meeting did take place. Here's the photograph of President Reagan, Rupert Murdoch, and Walter Remand in the background, instigating these investments into Project Democracy. And he's already got his hands, this is 1983, he's already got his hands on the PROMIS software from Inslaw Inc. And he's developing the lean software with CIA and the SWIFT banking software with Hadron and Simcom and Wang Labs in Australia. Covered the details of that in previous podcasts. Now mine is based on legal evidence of documents, media, records, annual reports, and as you can recall, I worked for his company that delivered the PROMIS software in Australia. So I know intimately what they were doing, and I had all their annual reports confirming that Rupert Murdoch was facing almost bankruptcy in 82 when he's rescued financially to then move in, become an American citizen, and start acquiring up the American media outlets. In exchange, he's bankrolling Project Democracy with all of this new money that he's got. But more important, he's got his hands on the coveted PROMIS software tapes, the 32-bit version for the VAX computers and the IBM computers, and he's developing the artificial intelligence enhanced lean software that is being put into the SWIFT banking networks for Follow the Money, for NSC, and for Oliver North, William Casey, and Walter Remand. And so Robert Parry, in his discussions with me and covered in his secrecy and privilege, he states quite categorically, and it was also published in 1992, in 1983, a plan hatched by CIA Director William Casey called Raising Private Money to sell the administration's Central American policies to the American public through an outreach program designed to look independent but which was secretly managed by the Reagan-Bush officials. The project was implemented by a CIA propaganda veteran, Can you see the common link of propaganda with 6i and Le Cercle? Internally with NSE was being managed by Walter Roman Jr., who had been moved to the National Security Council staff and put in charge of the perception management campaign that had both international and domestic objectives. In one initiative, Raymond arranged to have Australian media mogul Rupert Murdoch chip in money for ostensibly private groups that would back Reagan-Bush policies. According to a memo dated August 9th, 1983, Raymond reported that via Murdoch, and it's misspelled, a K rather than H, may be able to draw down added funds. For details, see Parry's secrecy of privileges, rise of Bush dynasty from Watergate to Iraq. This has been uncovered by Robert Parry. Robert Parry, when I was talking to him, did not know that Murdoch had the PROMIS software. He was astounded, and I shared other information with him. So during my discussions, he briefed me, showed me where to find the memos, which I did, and also gave me access to his photographs that he had uncovered to show that this meeting had actually taken place. I was interviewing Robert just before he passed away. A wonderful, credible investigative journalist. I sent to him this letter and memo that I had received from Bill Hamilton at the same time. And it was provided to Bill Hamilton was a letter addressed from William Bradford Reynolds to William Weld. And during our research, I have interviews and recorded interviews with an attorney who knows William Bradford Reynolds, and also was writing an autobiography for Elliot Richardson, who was a friend of his. And I've got my recorded interviews with him, and he confirms that this memo looks authentic. Bradford Reynolds confirmed that it is his signature. There's no question about that. And if he can recall, couldn't recall the details exactly, but he did recall that there was a memo that he had to draft from a telephone call that he received from Edwin Meese that was being transcribed for him being instructed to write this letter. And it says it's addressed to William Weld, a United States attorney. And what's important about this memo? My concern is it a fake to distract us? But I don't believe it is, and I'll tell you the reason for it. As agreed, Messrs. Manager Gorbanafar and Adnan Khashoggi and Richard Armitage. Isn't it interesting that Richard Armitage has turned up? Will broker the transaction of PROMIS software. Now, it's got an E on it, but remember it's being dictated by Ed Meese over the telephone. And so whoever's writing this down and transcribing is writing down what they think. PROMIS software, and it's to Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz, who's the largest shareholder and director of BCCI, for resale and general distribution as a gifts in the region contingent upon 3 conditions we last spoke of. PROMIS must have a soft arrival, no paperwork, customs or delay. It must be equipped with the special data retrieval unit. As before, you must walk the financial aspects through Credit Suisse, International Commercial Bank. If you encounter any problems, contact me directly. Sincerely, William Bradford Reynolds. Dated in 1985. Now, what jumped out at me? I've been working closely directly by letters with Michael Riconosciuto while he's in prison. My background is in physics, mathematics, and advanced computing. His background is in advanced physics, mathematics, and advanced computers too. And he has thoroughly enjoyed, Michael has enjoyed talking to me because he doesn't have to explain all the technologies all the time on how Echelon works, but also what modifications he made for the PROMIS. What was the purpose of that? Everyone in the media had talked about a backdoor. A backdoor, yes, that PROMIS allowed for CIA to spy on foreign governments, including allies, who received a copy of the PROMIS software. It allows them to download data, databases, and also see what investigations they're doing. So it was being sold to law enforcement and to intelligence agencies worldwide, for courts, for police investigations, for intelligence, fight against terrorism, money laundering. But if I take Australia, ASIO is our internal intelligence agency, ACES is our external. And they received the PROMIS software on VAX computers, and it was also installed at Echelon on VAX 11780 computers. I have all the records to prove that it was being installed in 1986 at ASIO, including Wang Labs computer systems. But it was with a VAX cluster. Now, why is this important? Because you need Echelon satellite system to be able to do the backdoor. Most people think that it's going to come through the internet or a telephone line. There are ways of transmitting information down the power lines, back on the power lines across the power wires and out of the building. You can transmit that way, and that's using the same sort of technologies, and that's another area that Echelon can use to get information in and out of buildings without detection. It's encrypted information pumped back on in America, your 120 or 110 voltage line. In Australia, it's 240 volts, but hidden in that information, you can transmit at internet speeds and Ethernet speeds information across the power lines, down through the power lines themselves, the power supplies going into your computers. But this is different. This is using a sophisticated data retrieval unit which uses a Bragg cell channel analyzer. My background is in diffraction physics, and so Michael was really pleased that I understood what a Bragg cell channel analyzer does, and it's on the NSA, CIA, Echelon satellites to retrieve information that's hidden into the noise of the electronics of the computer systems. And so most computer systems can be shielded so that you can't detect this RF interference that's coming out, electromagnetic radiation, but this is more sophisticated. It's a branch of physics and mathematics that's not taught normally at undergraduate level. And I've read all the books that Michael was reading, and he educated me during my discussions with him through letters from prison. But this is the first time in record, in any research that I've done in the media, in any publications that talk about PROMIS system, that is the true requirement, and that is you need a special data retrieval unit which is called a Bragg cell channel analyzer. The fact that that's included into this memo involving Manager, Gorbanafar, Adna Khashoggi, Richard Armitage and Sheikh bin Mahfouz, a director of BCCI, is valid. And the reason that it's valid is that I also will do a podcast. The BCCI investigation report confirms that United Press International, owned by Dr. Earl Bryan, had all their banking system with First National Bank and BCCI for all their financials in every country worldwide. That's what BCCI had done. They had introduced and put the whole BCCI banking network into United Press International outlets worldwide, and UPI has always been used as a front for CIA operatives as acting as journalists, and the same with News Limited, and the same with Robert Maxwell's companies. They are fronts for employment of journalists, investigative journalists, because that's how you get your information and can also be the first to be advised on whistleblowers who are going to blow open all of their operations of arms and drugs and any other criminal activities. First place people go is the media, thinking that it's going to be blowing the story, but it's really going to an agent who's tipped off immediately on what damaging information this person has. But the Special Data Retrieval Unit, Robert Parry and I had a wonderful discussion. He liaised with me. He was astounded by the research that I had uncovered and identified that Rupert Murdoch's company, together with Stanley Schumann, the same financial backer from Allen & Company, was on the board in 1982, appointed when Rupert Murdoch gets his hands on the PROMIS software directly from Bill Hamilton. The 32-bit version tapes were transferred to Australia, and Computer Power dumped him, claiming they couldn't sell one copy, but they still had the tapes and developed the lean software, which is what Michael testified in 1991 was the modified PROMIS software sold to the Australian government. So Danny Casolaro was correct. BCCI, Iran-Contra, PROMIS software deals. Now, I put up a website in November 2006, was the time when William Hamilton had recovered the DOJ a letter, and I had put up a podcast, and this is what I said. 6 months before FBI arrested Jonathan Pollard for espionage, Assistant Attorney General William Bradford Reynolds sent the May 16, 1985 letter to William Weld, the US Attorney, Boston, about arrangements made by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy and two Middle Eastern middlemen who later surfaced in the Iran-Contra scandal for the sale and distribution of a trapdoor version of PROMIS to the governments in the Middle East. The Arab broker identified in the letter is Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz. He's the largest shareholder in BCCI and headed Saudi Arabia's National Commercial Bank. Inslaw received a copy of the letter in late 2004, and that's when I got it, from a US intelligence source, and has since obtained convincing indications of its authenticity. And I can verify that it's authentic because no one knew you had to have this special device. It's called a Bragg cell channel analyzer, and it's advanced physics, and it needs to be installed onto Echelon satellites in order for you to extract the information from foreign governments and intelligence agencies who are using your PROMIS software. And Michael's job was to modify the PROMIS software so that it allows for the architecture of the computers, particularly the VAX computers, to be able to transmit hidden information that you cannot detect without the advanced physics and mathematics of the Echelon satellite network system. And so, Mahfouz, and this part's very important, 1 month before Danny Casolaro's found murdered. This is the top Saudi banker resigns to fight BCCI indictment. He's been indicted. This is published in the Washington Post. One of the Saudi Arabia's top bankers resigned today, saying he was devoting his energies to fighting allegations that he defrauded depositors of defunct bank BCCI. Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz, chief operating officer of the Mahfouz family-controlled National Commercial Bank, was charged by New York grand jury on July 1 with defrauding depositors and investors of $300 million in the BCCI affair. Among those who are being indicted for this scandal was Clark Clifford, Robert Altman, who Danny Casolaro was led to believe he was going to be meeting with Peter Wiedniks, who told the Federal Reserve Board in 1981 that BCCI would have no ownership or role at First American Bank shares. The two who ran the bank company for a decade until they resigned under pressure last August have denied they knew BCCI owned First American through their front companies. The BCCI indictments, another one published July, with the indictments yesterday, the BCCI case involving Clark Clifford, Robert Altman, and confirmation that fraud had been committed and $5 billion, not million, billion, was missing. And the people that were the directors of BCCI were indicted included Agfa Hassan Obaldi, Swala Navik, and the New Yorker, and as well as Gaith Ferron, who's a friend of Alexander Haig. Alexander Haig used to stay at his premises in USA. And the one I've underlined here is Faisal Saud Al-Falaj from Kuwait, including Kamal Adam, who was head of Saudi intelligence, and Saywid Jawari. Now, Faisal Saud Al-Falaj was the former chairman of the Kuwait Airlines, who contracted Ted Shackley's company, TGS, also employed Robert Sensi, and financed the BCCI checks for Adnan Khashoggi and Gorbanafar for the whole Aranda scandal, set up by Michael Ledeen with Gorbanafar and Ted Shackley, and also the vice president of TGS, who's the former head of SAVAK in Egypt, who set the whole thing up, and son of the former Prime Minister of Iran, who was assassinated. And behind all those previous declarations I did earlier in my podcast, they were behind the Knights of Malta and the Pat Robertson Christian Broadcasting Network, supplying the arms to Iran-Contra and Afghan rebels. So there you go. This is happening 4 weeks before Danny's found dead. And let's go back. And there's the letter involving the PROMIS software with Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz and Richard Armitage, Gorbanafar and Khashoggi. So this PROMIS software and special device allows them to infiltrate the SWIFT banking network, to move their funds and follow their funds. A deal being done with the blessing of Edwin Meese. And so it turns out that after poor Danny CASOLARO is found dead, it also shows that BCCI had defrauded the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and bribed heads of governments, central banks in Argentina, Peru, Nigeria, bribed officials of African Development Bank and 4 other African countries. The fact that Danny CASOLARO had the smoking gun and found dead, all financed by Kuwait, all roads lead to Robert Booth-Nichols, Frank Gallucci, Ted Shackley, William Casey, even though he had passed away, Oliver North, Richard Secord, but the Kuwait royal family. And so the Federal Reserve slaps a $170 million fine against Mahfouz, who's receiving the PROMIS software. He's not convicted, he just pays a $170 million fine. Isn't it sad how justice occurs? The guilty parties don't go to jail, the elite, but a journalist like Danny CASOLARO, an investigative author with credible evidence, who's investigating the real evidence that's been covered up by an Iran-Contra inquiry, the BCCI investigation team, loses their life, are murdered. There was $840 million invested by the national NCB into BCCI, but the figure lost was fraud that totaled and missing was close to so many $1 billion. And the question is, of course, BCCI investigation, $5 billion was missing. CIA had accounts with them. CIA was behind it. Robert Sensi, my podcast confirming his role with Robert Sensi, with William Casey, Kuwait royal family, and also Robert Gray and William Wilson, the ambassador to the Vatican, the fraud and deception of the Vatican Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, BCCI, and Nugenham Bank. And Senator Kerry's commission with Jack Blum fails to put any evidence up that Danny CASOLARO is holding, which is the real BCCI checks. So we have the same secret team identified by Lyndon LaRouche. And I'm tracking the PROMIS software, the loans affair in Australia, the evidence of Michael Riconosciuto in court, in his letters back to me from prison, and more importantly, my experiences of following the money and the incorporation documents and legal cases that have identified the same secret team is behind Get LaRouche. So LaRouche was a target because he published Dope Inc. Warning to stop terrorism, shut down Dope Inc. Lyndon LaRouche Jr. Dope Inc., the book that drove Henry Kissinger crazy, talked about the Opium Wars, the history of the Opium Wars, Britain and China. But he says United States, like China, was too great for the London money lords to occupy directly. One way America is being brought to heel is by the drug trade. Crime and other social problems in the US and Mexico are massively influenced by drugs and the drug dealing. Illicit drugs may now account for as much as $1 trillion annually in financing for criminal activity and corruption. This is an enormous black market, and it's funds that are moving, and there is no bank on planet Earth that isn't going to allow that $1 trillion to move through their banks. So hence, the banks have to be controlled by this secret elite team and intelligence agencies. He goes on to say that Democratic presidential candidate, he was running for president, and his motto was, whatever the world really thinks about the culprit known as Osama bin Laden, the real threat to civilization is chiefly a product of the way in which leading and other governments, including the government of USA, promoted and used terrorism and political assassinations. Methods of special warfare have been depended to an increasing degree on various forms of money laundering. Trafficking in drugs such as marijuana, cocaine and opium in the proceeds of illegal or quasi-legal weapons trafficking. Logistics of international terrorism using the notorious Cayman Islands conduit, junk bonds and related sorts of corporate takeovers and mergers, and the biggest money laundering channel of them all, the international financial derivatives racket. And I will show you in the following money, that it is definitely revealed in my evidence and my experience of Operation Stillpoint and the uncovering of Project Hammer using the PROMIS software leads to the same people at the top. The same elite team destroying Lyndon LaRouche, and behind the Cercle and the 6i, Knights of Malta, Opus Dei and the P2 Lodge, with CIA Knights of Malta memberships. What impressed me was that the last part is that Lyndon LaRouche really understood how the money laundering was working through the banks, but also the stock market, and using the financial derivatives instruments, which I will reveal to you is the key to success for why William Casey was secretary of the SEC, or the chairman of the SEC, and was the brains for OSS and CIA in their economic warfare program to bankrupt the Soviet Union. But also he knew how to move money and gold bullion, owned by CIA front companies and banks worldwide. This is really interesting. After he is exposing how dope and the war, as the worldwide international trafficking of drugs works, trillions of dollars, he even has a comment in the preface: "Dope Inc. is a book outstanding importance. It tells the history of a political strike against the United States in an undeclared war being waged by Great Britain." And it's Mitchell Verbal, former security and intelligence consultant to the US government. And so, how did they destroy Lyndon LaRouche? Now, I've confirmed to you that a member of the Cercle was Norman Bailey. National Security Council confirms that Lyndon LaRouche had one of the best private intelligence services in the world. He also had met with William Hamilton and confirmed to him that he knows that NSA was using Inslaw's PROMIS software in the Follow the Money program through the banks. So Norman Bailey is aware of PROMIS software. He's appointed for economic warfare within NSC, but he's also involved with the Cercle, with Ted Shackley, and all of his team for the Cercle and 6i. He says US sources told the Washington Post in 1985 that LaRouche organisation had assembled a worldwide network of government and military contacts, and that his researchers sometimes supplied information to government officials. Bobby Ray Inman, the CIA's deputy director, in 1981 and 82 said LaRouche and his wife had visited him, offering information about West German Green Party. Now, what's important here is in the court legal cases, it turns out that the person that opened the door for Lyndon LaRouche to meet with CIA was none other than Roy Frankhauser, working for the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party, is the person that opens the door for and arranges the meetings for Lyndon LaRouche to meet with CIA. How can you do that unless you're working with CIA all along? A CIA spokesman said LaRouche and Deputy Director John McMahon in 1983 to discuss one of LaRouche's trips overseas. An aide to the Deputy Secretary of State, even William Clark, said when LaRouche's associates discussed technology and economics, they made good sense and seemed to be qualified. And finally, Norman Bailey, formerly with National Security Council, said in 1985 that LaRouche's staff comprised one of the best private intelligence services in the world. So Lyndon LaRouche is reaching out to CIA, willing to assist them with his network of intelligence, investigative reporters and experts to assist them in their fight against terrorism, and also to expose the corruption within sales of technology, advanced technology to the Soviet Union, and also the rorts and frauds within the banking system and also in the stock market for the money laundering of drugs. And yet, who is brought in to help him? Well, it turns out that Roy Frankhauser had offered to provide security for Lyndon LaRouche, given that he had evidence that Henry Kissinger was trying to assassinate him over his attacks on Kissinger. And he's appointed as a national security advisor and assists Lyndon LaRouche's team to be trained in self-defense. And he brings in his friend, Mitchell Livingston Verbal III, who was a former OSS operative, mercenary, paramilitary trainer, firearms engineer and arms dealer. He was born in Philadelphia, the son of Tsarist cavalry officer in the Imperial Army of Russia in 1942. Verbal joined the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and served in China, Burma, and French Indochina. As a guerrilla operative during World War II, he carried out secret missions for the OSS under the command of Paul Halliwell, our famous drug money laundering baron, who set up the Castle Bank. In China with E. Howard Hunt, Lucien Conein, Zhong Xinglaub and Ray Klein. Well, that's where his loyalties will be with them. And who is Lyndon LaRouche attacking? All of them. They were paid with 5-pound sacks of opium. Verbal incorporated a company called Psionics to design suppressors for the M16 rifle. The name was an acronym for Studies in the Operational Negation of Insurgents and Counter-Subversion, known as Psionics. In 1967, he partnered with Gordon B. Ingram, inventor of the MAC-10 submachine gun. They added Verbal's suppressor to Ingram's machine gun, attempted to market to US military as Whispering Death for the use in the Vietnam War. Psionics was absorbed by Military Armament Corporation, known as MAC, later called Cobra, where Verbal developed training centre for counter-terrorism in 1970s. His courses lasted 11 weeks and students included members of military, high-risk executives, CIA agents and private individuals. Verbal concurrently ran Defence Systems International, an arms brokerage firm. So he's brought in to assist setting up security for Lyndon LaRouche for his house, his company that's in Leesburg Pike, where Ted Shackley's EastCo team is located, with Richard Secord and Mar Baud and also Michael Ledeen and Thomas Clines and Ed Wilson. In 1981 interview, Verbal revealed he was about to break with the US Labor Party, whose security staff he has been training at his Powder Springs, Georgia estate. Other exploits include an alleged but unsubstantiated presence at the Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. He's spearheading the 1965 invasion of the Dominican Republic, being tried and acquitted on charges of conspiracy to marijuana smuggling, reportedly in association with Jerry Patrick Hemming and with the acquiescence of Lucien Conein. So he's in league with Lucien Conein and Ted Shackley, his secret team, providing physical security service and training for Lyndon LaRouche's security forces. And so, in association with Roy Frankhauser and Mitch Verbal, in the later 1970s, the US Labor Party came into contact with Roy Frankhauser, a felon and government informant who had infiltrated a variety of groups. The LaRouche organisation believed Frankhauser was a federal agent assigned to infiltrate right-wing and left-wing groups, and that he had evidence that these groups were being manipulated, controlled by the FBI and other agencies. Frankhauser then introduced LaRouche to Mitchell Verbal, former OSS operative, paramilitary trainer, and arms dealer. Some members allegedly took 6-day anti-terrorist courses at his camp, operated by Verbal in Powder Springs. LaRouche denied that the trading sessions took place. Verbal introduced LaRouche to covert operations specialist Zhong Xinglaub. So look at this. LaRouche is attacking Kissinger and Ted Shackley's team, and surprise, surprise, through Roy Frankhauser, in comes Mitch Verbal, and now John Xinglaub from Wackle. one of the groups behind the Cercle and 6i, with Ted Shackley's team. And later said the members of the movement implied discussion with him that the military might help lead the country out of its problems, a view which he rejected. Verbal was also introduced LaRouche to Larry Cooper, a Powder Spring, Georgia police captain. Cooper, Frankhauser, and an associate of Frankhauser named Forrest Lee Fick later made allegations about LaRouche. So LaRouche has been set up. They're all CIA or former CIA. They're all part of Ted Shackley's secret team with Oliver North, and they're out to destroy him. Cooper said in an NBC broadcast interview in 1984 that LaRouche had proposed the assassination of Jimmy Carter, Brzezinski, Joseph Luns, and David Rockefeller. I mean, this is on their allegations that he's wanting to assassinate them. In 1984, LaRouche said that he had employed Verbal as a security consultant, but that the allegations coming from Verbal circles were fabrications that originated with operatives of FBI and other agencies, which are clearly NSC and CIA. The former Ku Klux Klan leader takes centre stage in Fed's case against LaRouche, and now we see that Roy Frankhauser opens the doors to CIA and is now the key witness to bring down charges against Lyndon LaRouche. It says a former Ku Klux Klan leader and government informant who served as a consultant to political extremist Lyndon LaRouche has emerged as a pivotal figure in the government's fraud case against leaders of the LaRouche empire. Much of the prosecution case, as outlined by Assistant U.S. Attorney John Markham, surrounded the statements and shadowy past of Roy Frankhauser. Frankhauser, 47, of Reading, Pennsylvania, one of the 13 charged, began cooperating with investigators shortly after his October 6 indictment on obstruction of justice charges, FBI agents said in his role as consultant to LaRouche. Frankhauser said he told leading members of the organisation's security and intelligence staff to burn incriminating evidence and send the 4 fundraisers overseas to avoid testifying before a grand jury, agents said. How can Roy Frankhauser, have access to setting up meetings with directors of CIA, bringing all of Ted Shackley's men, and then become the key witness to destroy Lyndon LaRouche when he's a member of the Ku Klux Klan, the American Nazi Party? I will do a follow-up, definitive podcast to show you the evidence that Roy Frankhauser was always working with Ted Shackley's team and Oliver North and Dwayne Claridge in Honduras and Nicaragua in their activities to assassinate leaders, and he set up all the BCCI bank accounts, for a Mossad agent to become the lead distributor of all the cocaine, $8 billion of cocaine shipments, hidden in Siemens transformers, transferred in 500 kilogram packages per shipment to America and Australia throughout the 1980s and 90s. And I found the evidence when I was investigating one of the directors of BCCI, who also is linked directly to the murder of Robert Calvi. And the evidence is overwhelming that Roy Frankhauser, when he worked as undercover for NSC for Henry Kissinger to infiltrate the Black September terrorist organisation, is when he met the top assassin of Mossad. And then they continued and worked with CIA in Honduras and Nicaragua to set up and run out of Brazil They transferred all the cocaine shipments from Panama and South America through Brazil, through the former Mossad assassins business, into Florida and USA, and it was Roy Frank Hauser, as a member of the Nazi Party, that had the links with Noriega and Pablo Escobar for Oliver North, and Dwayne Claridge and CIA and Ted Shackley to facilitate $8 billion, not million, $8 billion of cocaine trafficking throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, with the blessing of DEA. And he is the key witness that destroyed Lyndon LaRouche, the biggest cocaine distributor and involved in the assassinations as part of Oliver North's team. Attended meetings in White House with Oliver North, had his own office at Langley with the Counter-Terrorism Center for CIA, and I found him through all my investigations of following the money through Australia with one of the directors of BCCI. I found the evidence of the murder of Robert Calvi, linked to the same director of BCCI, and also the evidence of Roy Frankhauser setting up all the BCCI accounts for the laundering of the cocaine, with Noriega and Pablo Escobar through BCCI accounts into Florida. And this BCCI director that I tracked all of the money laundering evidence of BCCI was Armand Hammer. And I'll do a whole podcast on how I found the evidence when I found the financial advisor who worked for Armand Hammer and his associates who are linked to the Nazi Party and the Hitler's bankers in Switzerland, and were involved in negotiating for Armand Hammer all the oil contracts with Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, and also the oil contracts in Iran and the Soviet Union. And Armand Hammer was one of the original directors with Jackson Stevens in the company that became BCCI, with the BCCI directors and with Robert Altman and Clark Clifford as their attorneys. So he takes centre stage. Frankhauser becomes the key witness for prosecutions for the Department of Justice, and who was under the contract to LaRouche for 7 years, was once a leader of the Ku Klux Klan in Pennsylvania and had been associated with the American Nazi Party, and was convicted in connection with the bombing of the schools bus in Pontiac, Michigan in 1970s. Frankhauser was also served as a government informant, working closely with FBI. I have recovered all of his FBI records. His code name was William Clay, Bill Clay, and I will present to you evidence that he continued to use that as his code name when setting up all the BCCI accounts with Noriega and Pablo Escobar, the bank accounts for the shipping of $8 billion of cocaine. In 1972, according to published accounts, he was sent to Toronto on an undercover mission approved by National Security Council with Henry Kissinger to infiltrate the Black September group, just 2 months after the organisation killed 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. And this is where he met Mossad's top assassins. It's unclear that Frank Hauser's role will be at the trial since he remains under indictment. Prosecutors declined to comment. His indictment is just a front. He is the key witness that undermined and produced all the evidence for Shackley's team and Oliver North and Buck Revell to have evidence to prosecute LaRouche. When the left reaches the right, and here's an article about Liberty Lobby. Now this part's very important. I'm going to open your eyes to, it wasn't just Roy Frankhauser and Mitchell Vavell and John Sinlaub that destroyed LaRouche. It turns out that there is someone else who I believe was always on the inside and linked to intelligence. And it's not just NSC, but it goes to the Pentagon. Liberty Lobby, an ultra-conservative group based in Washington, has advertised and sold copies of 129-page NCLC describing what NLCC says is a terrorist apparatus for government agencies, private research groups and political organisations coordinated by the Carter administration, the Central Intelligence Agency and the Rockefeller interest to de-industrialise America, to go to war with the Soviet Union by 1978. Lyndon LaRouche, 54, leader and 1976 presidential candidate, was hired as personal security advisor Mitchell Vavell, and anti-communists who assisted Cuba's strongmans until Fidel Castro's takeover in 1959. LaRouche claims he is an assassination target of the Meyersbader Meinhof organizations in West Germany and needs protection. Liberty Lobby, which has an extensive record of anti-Zionism, complained in Spotlight's review of the terrorism report. For example, NCLC did not mention any of the major Zionist groups, such as Notorious Anti-Defamation League, involved in the alleged Rockefeller-Carter terrorism apparatus. Verbel, the tough-talking gun manufacturer and security advisor to NCLC's LaRouche, says that NCLC hired him when it learned of the Radical Beta Meinhof, or Red Morning, organisation planned to assassinate LaRouche during the current visit to West Germany. Persons identifying themselves as members of the Red Morning group claim responsibility for the July 30 terrorist murder of prominent West German bank executive Jürgen Ponto. So, it goes on, CIA, FBI agents destroyed Lyndon LaRouche. And this is an article in 1988. 3 intelligence operatives said that FBI and CIA officials asked them to infiltrate the political organisation of extremist Lyndon LaRouche, a declassified document shows. The document was made available Wednesday to defence lawyers in fraud and conspiracy trial of LaRouche, 6 aides and 5 of his political groups. The defence, which claims the criminal charges emerged from a White House-directed plot to ruin LaRouche, won a delay in the trial as a result of the document and a previous disclosed memo indicating 2 key players in the Iran-Contra scandal discussed collecting evidence against LaRouche. A federal judge ordered the prosecutor to search government files for any additional evidence that should be surrendered to defence lawyers. In a separate decision, a federal appeal court ruled Wednesday that NBC must surrender to a judge outtakes from a 100-minute interview with former LaRouche consultant who said an aide to the political extremist discussed a plot to assassinate Henry Kissinger. The network broadcast a 1-minute excerpt of the interview in April 1986. So Lyndon LaRouche has been attacking with doping, the trillion-dollar drug laundering operations through banks, attacking the links of Henry Kissinger, and now allegations are being raised, and we've got Roy Frankhauser, John Sinlaub, Mitchell Vavell, tightly all around Lyndon LaRouche, and there are allegations that he's trying to assassinate Henry Kissinger. In the court case, January 31st, 1989, the United States versus LaRouche. Its key witness is Frank Hauser. On October 19, however, when the trial court granted the motion to sever Frank Hauser, the circumstances favouring severance changed significantly. Greenberg told the court that Frank Hauser had provided an unconditional affidavit stating that Frank Hauser did not have any of the conversations as alleged in the overt acts with Robert Greenberg. The court decided that it would permit introduction of evidence of Mr. Frank Hauser's membership in the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazi Party, and at the point all the defendants, including Frank Hauser, asked for the severance. The court warned the parties that a separate preliminary Frank Hauser trial would delay their own trial, but they still asked for severance. And the court then concluded that although Frank Hauser's severance would delay the start of the main trial, it would nevertheless simplify the main trial, and the main trial jurors would end up serving less actual time. And so the games are starting, stating that the original estimates of the trial length made by the council had been grossly wrong on the underside. The district court granted the defendant's motion to excuse the jurors in relevant part because it believed that the trial would extend into the fall, perhaps until late fall. And so the district court also found the length of the trial was increased by defendant's strategy and manner of defence. The district judge stated when dismissing the jury that had he known then in December 1987 what I know now, I would have at least doubled the 6 to 7 month estimate I gave you. The court specifically found that 5 weeks or 6 weeks or even 8 weeks of delay the defendants claimed the government cause made no difference, and the record adequately supports that conclusion. We add that even were that not so, even if Frank Hauser's severance, the North Talix delay, and this is now the game being played, the North Talix delay and the Emerson delay had caused the added hardship that led to the jurors' dismissal. It would make no legal difference. That is because the defendants themselves asked the court to excuse the jurors, and the prosecution did not bring about the motion deliberately or through any form of egregious or unfair behaviour that could be considered objectively as equivalent to an intentional effort to provoke mistrial. Of course they did. So the government was withholding key evidence, the memos of Oliver North, their insiders within the LaRouche, that were providing all the information, and it clearly leads to Roy Frankhauser, Mitchell Verbal, John Singlaub, and several CIA agents working with them to undermine and establish evidence to have Lyndon LaRouche and his team prosecuted. All orchestrated by Oliver North and Oliver Buck Revell. Now, I'm going to give you evidence that you would not know of. And this comes from my investigations of the PROMIS software in Australia. What no one knows is this. Lyndon LaRouche owned a company called Computron Technologies with the founder, Mark Stellman. And I'm going to show you that on the inside was somebody who was always working with intelligence, with NSC and with Pentagon, and most likely with CIA. And I'll prove it to you. Major clients of LaRouche's Computron Technologies Corporation included Mobil Oil and Citibank. Citibank, where the PROMIS software was installed for Project Hammer, as testified by Michael Riconosciuto, and independently testified 10 years later by General Earl Cockey, who represented the Nugan Bank, the World Bank, and identified Project Hammer among its clients. And his World Composition Services had one of the most advanced typesetting complexes in the city and had the Ford Foundation among its clients. Computron Technologies had a partnership with, you guessed it, Wang Labs, who is the business partner of Rupert Murdoch and Earl Bryan's, their company Computer Power Group, and Simcom Inc. and Hadron Inc., who are developing the fusion of intelligence databases for William Casey. Their partnership was to develop the casino accounting and Swift banking computer systems for, wait for it, Resorts International, owned by Allen & Co. Allen & Co. are the financial investors behind Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc., News Limited and Computer Power Group that has the PROMIS software in Las Vegas and Bahamas. Allen & Co. are the investors of Dr. Earl Bryan's company, as I said to you, Hadron Inc., Rupert Murdoch and News Limited. But Mark Stellman was the founder and president of Computon Technologies. So I did research. He's been there all along, throughout the 70s and 80s, and it's a company that's critical to the links of CIA and PROMIS. I'm going to show you that in addition to Wang Labs, with Ang Wong and Charlie Cross, with Roger Allen, Ted Prince and Rupert Murdoch for computer power, backed by Stanley Human, who's the common investor as the managing director of Allen & Co., is Mark Stellman, intimately involved with Wang Labs, Swift banking, and intelligence. And he is the founder of Computron with Lyndon LaRouche. And where did he go after Lyndon LaRouche is destroyed? He sets up the Office of Nest Assessment, ONA, at Pentagon, with Paul Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby, and Richard Pearl. And didn't I tell you that my research into the PROMIS software was upsetting the neocons, involving Paul Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby, Richard Pearl, and Douglas Faith, the neocons at Pentagon, with Paul Wolfowitz being appointed as the new president of the World Bank, and sitting there is the founder of the company Computron, which was the company owned by Lyndon LaRouche. And it had special purposes. Computron was providing all the accounting systems for detecting money laundering at the resorts casinos, which was used by CIA and Mafia for laundering the drugs. President Dwight Eisenhower, in his farewell speech, says, "In the councils of government we must guard against acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defence, with our peaceful methods and goals to the security and liberty may prosper together." So Rupert Murdoch, Stanley Schumann on the board of News Limited, acquire Computer Power Group, distributor of Inslaw Inc.'s software for the markets of Australia and Asia, are supported by Roy Cohen opening the doors with Walter Remand. Charles Wick set up the Project Democracy with Walter Remand, and Charles Wick gets appointed when he resigns from USI onto the board of News Limited. So now we have a direct link. Stanley Schumann, who is actually on the President's Foreign Intelligence Board. We've got Charles Wick gets appointed to the board of News Limited, and it was Walter Remand that Lyndon LaRouche was identifying was the brains behind Project Democracy. And Ned, and this is where it leads now to the PROMIS software with the neocons and the destruction of Lyndon LaRouche. I remind you that the second application that Michael identified in court and in his letters to me was that the modified PROMIS software for CIA was for SWIFT banking. It was installed at Transaction Technologies Inc., a subsidiary of Citibank, for Dr. Earl Bryan and Hadron Inc. and CIA to move covert funds through international clearing houses. I now have proven previously in all my podcasts the legal memos of CIA, the ventures, the publicity, the definitive links between Wang Labs with Dr. Ang Wang, Charlie Cross, who developed the SWIFT network in Virginia and Brussels for Wang Labs and CIA. We're in partnership with Earl Bryan, in partnership with Rupert Murdoch, with Computer Power Group, with the PROMIS software and Lean software sold to the Australian government, and they both all had common investor Stanley Schumann on the President's Foreign Intelligence Board, but he was the managing director of Allen & Company that owned Resorts International. So we have a common link. The owners of Resorts International is Allen & Company. And our friend here, Mark Stallman, has developed the company with Lyndon LaRouche that provides all of the money laundering and chip tracking systems for Resort International with CIA, with SWIFT banking, and Resorts International's traditional links with Meyer Lansky and his links with Israel, mafia, for the money laundering of drugs worldwide. So we now come across to Citibank, CIA fusion software that turns into the Iris SWIFT banking. But let's have a look at Charlie Cross at Wang Labs. I've covered him before. He was responsible for development of the SWIFT network with Wang Labs, with CIA. He developed Wang's retail banking strategy, the SWIFT automated financial environment, SWIFT 2 compliant in Virginia and Belgium, the first privately approved SWIFT vendor with SWIFT 2 certification. And then it turns into R&D versus Shark. Invited to work personally for Ang Wang, CEO of Wang Labs, and work closely with data provider customers of stock markets and broker houses, third-party application developments API. Now this part's very important. He was the principal software engineer responsible for StratPlan with Computer Power Group News Limited for the Australian government, which was for tracking all social welfare fraud. And they developed the Lean software. He also developed remote WangNet and Wang Professional Image Computer, Wang Labs word processing and super mini computers. And then he also established the WP Service Bureau. Portion of company managed all related, developed extensive case tracking system, Naval Discharge Review Board. So here's his link directly with it. So we've got this guy, and we've got Roger Allen, and we've got Ted Prince, president of responsible. So there's the overlap with them. Then a crisis in Wall Street occurs in 1987. It says the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted 508 points, rolling financial markets around the world, dubbed Black Monday. That day, more than 608 million shares changed hands, more than triple their daily volume. I remember that day perfectly. I ran a research company in Melbourne with professors from universities, and it was a terrible time for getting capital. WSCR reported on how systems fed the view from the trenches, and it says computer-driven trading systems such as programs trading and portfolio insurance were blamed for causing market volatility that sent prices into freefall. They then said it was automation that helped securities industries survive the avalanche of orders that poured through the New York Stock Exchange, SuperDot systems. Comparing the situation to a MASH unit with oncoming wounded, Timothy Cronin, President and CEO of Wang Financial Information Service Corp., which provided the Shark and online stock quote trading services, said anyone operating that day was way beyond the design envelope, way in outer space. It was controlled chaos. So we've now got Wang Labs Financial Systems, which provided Shark online stock quote trading service. Also, Wang Labs had announced in 1982 and 83 their partnership with Rupert Murdoch's company. Wang Labs is developing the CIA fusion software called CIA Safe for CIA and DIA, which became the CIA Iris Swift banking software. And here's a photograph of our Roy Cohen introducing Rupert Murdoch to President Reagan. Isn't it interesting that Jimmy Rothstein, New York detective, was investigating the evidence of CIA's Operation Compromise, the compromise of politicians worldwide with pedophiles, is Roy Cohen. And also is investigating Ed Wilson running a similar operation of compromise. He's the guy that opens the door for Rupert Murdoch. And in the background there is Walter Remond, who has got the support of William Casey, Oliver North, and Rupert Murdoch has agreed to bankroll Project Democracy. And so in this, it's talking about Computer Power Group, its partnership with Wang Lab. It's got its law enforcement and court system called Status, a retrieval system that handles text and numerical data retrieval systems, and they are going to launch it, okay, as a partnership with Wang Labs. Also, Wang Labs then confirms that it's going to launch its worldwide integrated banking applications. Wang's Swift interface called SAFE. Don't you like that? CIA SAFE software. And have a look. Who's the partner? Computron's accounting packages. This was owned by Lyndon LaRouche. And it was the founder who was his partner. And he's working with Wang Swift banking software, and they called it SAFE, which is the CIA SAFE system that was being developed with Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc., and Computer Power Group. Here's an article called Empire Builder, dated 1988. When people talk about L.W. Brian, they tend towards strong opinions one way or the other. His admirers say he has the Midas touch, an ability to buy and revive troubled companies that has helped him build a network of businesses in Washington and in California, specializing in biotechnology and information services. On Wall Street, when the 46-year-old entrepreneur needs money, it appears that all he has to do is call, there you go, Allen & Co. The family investment partnership. This guy has a record for taking things that are sick and making them well, said Ned Patterson, Allen & Company's retired executive vice president. Allen & Co. owned Resorts International, casinos. Computron provided the accounting systems, and Wang Labs was providing the computer systems. Stanley Schumann, as you can see, Managing Director of Allen & Company, was appointed to the board of News Limited in 1982. He was the Director of News America since 1985, Director of Carnegie Hall. He was appointed by President Clinton to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, also on the Board of Visitors of Institute of Public Policy Science, Public Affairs at Duke University. And this is the overlap with Dr. Earl Bryan with Duke University. And he was chairman from 1992 to 1996. Mr. Schumann is also a member of the Council of Foreign Affairs Relationships, Council of Foreign Relations, CFR, Director of Markham Foundation, a member of the Bar of Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the Bar of State. So he is intelligence through and through. Bankrolling Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc. and Computer Power Group's company involved with development of the SWIFT banking network, the lean software, CIA's PROMIS software sold to the Australian government with artificial intelligence. And here's the big one. The Shark Expo merges Wang data with LMT software, banking on a seamless link between spreadsheet analytics, real-time financial information. Wang Financial Information Services Corp and leading market technologies have agreed to co-market a product merging the Shark data feed with extensive display and analytical software. Dubbed Shark/Expo, the new product combines Wang's Shark quotation and financial information feed with LMT's Expo, a spreadsheet and graphics software linking data feed, analytical software and Shark. So not only banking, SWIFT banking, but the stock market. Confirmation that Wang caters to financial markets with VS tools. Wang Labs and their software offering is financial subsidiaries using Shark's executive services, provide market information, real-time quote automation systems installed in many of the large trading institutions, Wang spokesman said. So we have SWIFT banking and real-time stock market financial services. And this one goes that it's talking about Shark Expo, so I'll keep going there. And here's the big one. Earl Bryan, Infotechnology purchases Shark from Wang Labs. Infotechnology Inc., a completed and previously announced purchase of Shark professional market quote business from Wang Laboratories for $16 million, mostly in cash. The business, now named Shark Information Service Corp, is a majority owned and controlled by Infotechnology Inc., with Financial News Network Inc. holding a large minority share. So the relationship for SWIFT banking at Citibank, as confirmed by Michael Riconosciuto's testimony, is also backed up with the partnership that Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc. had with CIA, State Department, for the CIA safe SWIFT banking software and also integration into the stock market. And here is the incorporation documents and verification that who is the owner now of Wang Labs, Wang Financial Information Services Corp. It's Dr. Earl W. Bryan. So we have confirmation that not only was it Wang Labs, Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc., Computer Power Group, but we also have confirmation that it was Computron, with the company that was owned by Lyndon LaRouche, that the founder of that company is really always working with intelligence. So now let's have a look of what his background is and how he fits into this. He was the founder of Computron and founder of Wang Labs CIA Safe and CIA Swift banking software, with Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc. with Earl Bryan, and Computer Power Group with News Limited for the PROMIS software. It says here Mark Stallman, after moving to New York City in 1972 to join the SDS National Caucus of Labour Committees with Lyndon LaRouche, run by the Marxist economist Lyndon LaRouche. He co-founded a software company called Computron Inc., becoming the company's vice president of R&D. In his role, he consulted to Citibank in its effort to build the new machine. This is PROMIS through and through. Mark Stallman left Computron to join Wang Labs, where he was recruited to direct WangNet local area network projects with CIA. Mark Stallman had earlier consulted Wang on its VS computer project, and the Citibank new bank machine effort was based on the Wang 928 architecture as used the Wang word processing systems. So Michael Riconosciuto's testimony that Swift banking using the PROMIS software was installed at Citibank Transaction Technologies. His confirmation of the overlap of Computer Power Group, Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc., Wang Labs, and Computron director who worked for Lyndon LaRouche. I believe he was always intelligence, and not only was it Roy Frankhauser, John Sinlaub, and Mitch Verbal, and 2 other CIA agents, but I believe that he was on the inside, and the information and banking systems. In the court cases, Roy Frankhauser confirms that he was using the computer systems at Computron for all of the banking transactions. That was the evidence that was compiled to convict with credit cards Lyndon LaRouche and his team. More important, Mark Storman had earlier consulted with on Wang Labs, but he then went to work for General Instrument Corp, where he ran an in-house venture fund making investments in Israel and Silicon Valley. So we are talking about, he's a neocon with his links with Israel. All along, Allen and Company, with their links with Meyer Lansky and Israel, run the Resorts International casinos for money laundering. And now we've got all the neocons that he's working with, Paul Wolfowitz, we've got Douglas Faith, we've got Scooter Libby, Richard Pearl, and Pentagon Intelligence. He then joins Sanford C. Bernstein Inc. Now this is very important as an analyst following local area network status including the Unger Bass and 3Com. Stallman expanded the coverage to include mini-computers including Compaq, Apple, and part of Alliance Capital. Salmon became the first and for a long time analysts recommend the new public Sun Microsystems, now part of Oracle. Mark Stallman coined the term network computing, which Sun later adopted as its corporate slogan. The network is the computer. And here's the crunch. Mark Stallman was hired by Alex Brown and Sons to oversee the networking computing section of ABS Banking, where he successfully led the IPO of America Online. America Online was on the board was Alexander Haig. But this is the crunch. Alex Brown and Son was run by Alvin Bernard Buzzy Krongard. He was the chairman of Alex Brown and Sons and appointed executive director of CIA. He's the key person that I was having legal dispute with. He was on the board of Johns Hopkins Medicine, and he's responsible for CIA's Project Hammer for the money laundering of gold bullion and US security notes through Citibank using the PROMIS software. And here is the link. He's working directly with him. Also, Alex and Brown and Sons represented Cytex, owned by Robert Maxwell, was one of their largest clients. And so there's the overlap with the PROMIS Swift banking with Robert Maxwell with Cytex. And if you do the corporate searches on Cytex, you'll find it's the 2 sons of the Prime Minister of Israel who are on the board of Cytex, which was the legal case for the funds being laundered and collapsed during his collapse financially. So we now have a definitive corporate link back to Project Hammer at Citibank, which substantiates the evidence given by General Earl Cockey, who represented Nugenhan Bank, World Bank, and confirms the massive money laundering program and laundering of gold bullion. And that confirms the confirmation that the founder of Computron, in a joint venture with Computer Power Group, with Rupert Murdoch, Wang Labs, for Swift banking, is actually CIA's PROMIS software with Rupert Murdoch's company, Computer Power Group. And now we have found that the founder of Computron, which was owned by Lyndon LaRouche, was really the person working on the PROMIS software in the banking industry with Wang Labs, CIA, and then sets up the Office of National Assessment for Pentagon with the neocons. And so here it is, Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment with Paul Wolfowitz. Net assessment, beginning around 2012, Stallman worked with Phil Midland, US Navy retired, to provide research for Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. Now remember, this is very important. It shows that he's in the intelligence game. And looking at China, digital technology, Office National Assessment focused on China in the 1990s following the demise of the Soviet Union. Stallman's primary contribution to this strategic analysis has been to further understand the effects of digital technology in Chinese civilization. In 2015, Marshall retired from Office of National Assessment, and which he founded in 1973, and Stallman and Midland then formed Center for Study of Digital Life, where Stallman is the president. Phil Midland served 20 years at the US Navy, retiring as captain, and his role was he as executive assistant to NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Command, Chief of Staff, Intelligence Fleet, US Naval Attaché, People's Republic of China. Phil Midland led a variety of international negotiations, defence, relationships with the peoples of China, technology transfer during the Reagan administration. Successful negotiating upgrade of command and control networks for US, Japan, Australia, Singapore, Malaysia and Korea, establishing military links with India, South Africa, Operation Restore Democracy in Haiti. Don't you just love it? And he was also educated at Johns Hopkins University. Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment involved Paul Wolfowitz and Louis Scooter Libby, who are upset about my PROMIS software investigations. And Andrew Marshall, died in 2009, was an American foreign policy strategist who served the Director of the United States Department Defense Office of Net Assessment from 1973 right through to 2015, appointed by President Richard Nixon. Marshall remained in office during all the successive administrations up until 2015. What is the Office of Net Assessment? The original main task of the office was to provide strategic evaluations on nuclear war issues, including simulations, and Michael confirmed to me the PROMIS software was being used by NATO for the simulation in Europe of nuclear war. Andrew Marshall was consulted for 1992 draft of defence planning guidance created by the Department of Defence staffers Scooter Libby, Paul Wolfowitz, Zalmi Khalilzad, and whom took influential roles under the administration of George W. Bush. So, Mark Stallman, the founder of Computron, the R&D vice president, owned by Lyndon LaRouche, was always there behind the scenes with his links with intelligence and the neocons. He also is intimately involved in the CIA Safe Swift software development with Computer Power Group, Hadron Inc. and Wang Labs, and then moves across to Alex Brown and Sons with A.B. Krongard, who is running Project Hammer at Citibank, and with Deutsch Alex Brown, Project Hammer, using the PROMIS software. So it's quite clear that Lyndon LaRouche was not only undermined by Roy Frankhauser opening the doors for him to meet with CIA, introducing Singlaub and Mitchell Verbal and two other CIA agents to fabricate the evidence against him. And the fact is that he's the liaison with CIA and with Oliver North, and running the biggest cocaine network throughout the 80s and 90s for Oliver North and Dwayne Claridge with Ted Shackley's team, is incredible. that Lyndon LaRouche was undermined by the same people behind the Cercle and 6i. And my evidence revealed the link of Buzzy Krongard when he get appointed to CIA's number 3 ranked job. Former chairman and chief executive of Alex Brown was named executive director of Central Intelligence Agency. Conrad gave up a $4 million year job bonus, 3 years to go, become counsellor to CIA director George Tenet. Will run the agency day-to-day operations. And my legal cases and evidence and court cases I found were CIA operatives working for CIA's bogus prints that came to Australia in CIA Operation Steel Point, were CIA operatives working directly for CIA Director George Tenet. So we've got the fingerprints of A.B. Krongard, CIA, all over CIA Operation Steel Point, and the evidence that shows that it was using the PROMIS software, and also Alex Brown and son with the same person, A.B. Krongard. My overlap is the Johns Hopkins Medicine, were my business partners with Johns Hopkins Applied Physics, but just happens they're the architects of Echelon, and also behind the development of the command control systems for the Trident submarines, the fire control systems, with Hadron Inc. My life, unfortunately, overlapped with the fraud case and CIA Operation Steel Point, and hence attracted the attention of CIA and the neocons and the appearance of Rupert Nichols in Australia to make the threats against me. So Conrad is credited with helping build Alex Brown, Bankers Trust, and then joins as the executive director of CIA after his departure of Banker Trust doubled along with its Alex Brown unit sold to Germany's Deutsche Bank. So the neocons that took over the Cercle 6i, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Michael Ledeen, are clearly with Alexander Haig and also Ted Shackley, were fearful of Danny Casolaro's investigation of the evidence of the PROMIS software, Iran-Contra, BCCI fraud, and were also upset that I was working with Michael Riconosciuto uncovering the real evidence of where PROMIS software was installed for SWIFT banking and used for money laundering through all the banks. And that explains why Bill Hamilton was approached by a mysterious Pentagon spy advising him that my research is upsetting the neocons. And I was communicating with Bill Hamilton that my research shows Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Scooter Libby are directly linked to the PROMIS software, and that clearly are linked to Rafi Aiton with the $2 billion broker of death arms deal involving the former DIA director, sponsored by GINSA, with Michael Ledeen, and also a CIA agent who sponsored by Michael Ledeen to fly to Israel. He sponsored the CIA agent to fly to Israel and met directly with Rafi Aiton. And I'll present that as definitive evidence that the PROMIS software with Rafi Aiton was originally integrated for aerostats, drones, AWAC radar tracking technology during the war in Lebanon, and then that was the contract that Peter Wiedniks was handling with the aerostat and AWAC radar tracking contracts for the interdiction program for the war on drugs and terrorism with Hadron Inc. and the PROMIS software. And I have definitive evidence that Rafi Aiton then met in Israel with Richard Secord, William Casey. It was known as CIA Operation Tip Kettle. And I'll do a whole podcast on this so that you can see the importance of Michael Ledeen and GINSA, Paul Wolfowitz at the very beginning. They both were members of GINSA and arranged for this original meeting for Secord to fly across to meet with Rafi Aiton with William Casey to negotiate the sale of the PLO AK-47s captured from the PLO and wanted to supply to the Nicaraguan resistance. Raffiatin requested William Casey to approve Israel to acquire a high-security clearance company called Numax Electronics that manufactures night vision technologies. And it turns out that Danny CASOLARO had the Indochina report involving arms deals and trafficking with drugs and heroin involving Solomon Schwartz, a Mossad agent, together with Earl Bryan, George Oken with the Gambino Mafia, and Peter Wiedniks. And Solomon Schwartz was working with Numax Electronics, night vision equipment being equipped with the guns that have been sold. So there you have the overlap. Michael Ledeen worked with Alexander Haig, Ted Shackley, and appeared in Melbourne the same day that at the Australian-Israel Business Committee. On the same day, Robert Booth Nichols met with me, confirming that he works with CIA, Mafia, threatened my life. He then advised that all my problems lead to Alexander Haig. Paul Wolfowitz was leading the efforts of Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, Scooter Libby. They were the founders of GINSA and PANAC. The same Pentagon spy was Lieutenant Lobomir Julian Demchuk. He met also with Christopher Story. So the same spy advising William Hamilton that I'm upsetting the neocons with my PROMIS research, and my experience with CIA Operation Stillpoint is the same Pentagon spy who asks to meet with Christopher Story. And it turns out that Gordon Thomas, author of the book Robert Maxwell, Israel's Super Spy, and using the PROMIS software, advised Christopher Story to meet with a man called Walker, whose alias was an alias, but his real name he was a Ukrainian, name is Demchuk. This operative was said to have Pentagon links. And so Christopher Edward Hale published his book, The New Underworld Order, and clearly identifying the role of European Union collective and also the dark alliance of money laundering of drugs and weapons, incriminating evidence against Henry Kissinger. Christopher Edward was also the Intelligence and Economic Affairs Advisor to Margaret Thatcher, and he ran what was called the International Currency Review, which included the World Bank, Federal Reserve and the Bank of England amongst its subscribers. So his credibility in economic finance is second to none. But he became the economic advisor to the Prime Minister of Margaret Thatcher, and in 1991, a year after Reagan, he published Soviet analyst skepticism about the role that Mikhail Gorbachev perestroika really had. But how does this fit in? Well, the same Pentagon spy who wanted to meet with Christopher Story was meeting with Leo Wanta and Michael Cottrell to investigate overwhelming evidence and document evidence of George H.W. Bush and CIA Operation Stillpoint, and involving secret trillion-dollar money laundering transactions of gold bullion through Citibank and World Bank. Before Christopher Story died in 2010, he was investigating the evidence that Leo Wanta was linked to the Global Security Fund, set up by, underline, Jacob Rothschild. And this is where I will stop and continue, because I'm now going to reveal my overwhelming evidence that I found independently from Australia, the CIA Operation Stillpoint bogus prints that destroyed us, and the affiliation with the movement of billions of dollars of gold bullion from Russia, Japan and China through Citibank and World Bank and the Rothschilds banks. And its links with Robert Booth Nichols, and it's in companies, and I've got corporate records that confirm the links. They set up foundations for international humanitarian funds, tax deductible in London to clear these. And it involves the Rothschilds banking networks with NM Rothschilds, Royal Bank of Scotland, Bank of New Zealand, Deutsche Bank, UBS Bank, Citibank, and more importantly, linked back to the Cercle with the neocons and Ted Shackley's team, and with George Bush Sr. My evidence is overwhelming, and I will show you the links and definitive links back with Project Hammer, with A.B. Krongard at Citibank and Alex Brown. They were setting up a gift foundation to receive the $1 billion donation from the bogus prince for our UN SEAL program that was destroyed. They had a gift foundation set up in California. I've got all the incorporation documents for that, and its links across to my partnership with John Hopkins being destroyed, with a company called Amcare International, whose executive and financial director was Frank Bosnell, who owned Business Risk International Inc., who employed Major Joseph Queller, who set the meeting up for Danny Casolaro. You can't make these things up, and I will prove to you that Herbert Bost was the personal contact for Robert Booth Nichols in his court testimonies, and Robert Booth Nichols confirms he was working directly for Frank Gallucci. Herbert Bost was a retired naval intelligence man who was the personal friend of Ferdinand Marcos and moving all of his gold bullion worldwide through his banks in Switzerland and the foundations with the mafia as part of CIA Operation Still Point.